When you see all the geopolitical tension in the world, you'd think oil prices would be going through the roof. But what if I told you the opposite is happening? That they're actually set to fall? Yeah, really. In this explainer, we're going to dive into the surprising forces that are completely rewriting the rules of the global oil game. I mean, turn on the news any given day, right? There's conflict flashing across our screens. The old rule book says that means oil prices should be skyrocketing. But is that what's really happening out there?
Nope, not at all. Actually, if you look at the forecasts, they show Brent's crude averaging just 58 bucks a barrel by 2026. $58. So what on earth is going on? How can prices possibly be falling when the world feels this uncertain? Well, that's the mystery we're going to solve today.
Okay, so the answer starts with one simple, overwhelming fact. The world is basically awash in oil. We're facing a massive supply glut. There is just way more oil being pumped out of the ground than the world actually needs right now. And that changes everything. It really just comes down to classic economics, but on a global scale. On one side, you've got this absolute tidal wave of supply. And on the other, demand growth is starting to slow down. Things like better energy efficiency and, of course, the rise of electric vehicles are really starting to make a dent. And look, the scale of this imbalance is just staggering. By 2026, projections show global supply hitting over 108 million barrels per day. At the same time, demand is lagging behind at under 106 million. That is a massive gap. So, all this extra oil has to go somewhere, right? It's just pouring into storage tanks all over the world. We're talking about global inventories building up by nearly 3 million barrels every single day. And that is exactly what's putting this immense downward pressure on prices. All right, so the big question is, where is all this new oil coming from? It's not the names you'd usually think of. It's time to meet the new oil superpowers who are driving this whole surplus. Believe it or not, the heart of this supply explosion is right here in the Americas. We're looking at the United States, Brazil, Guyana, and Canada. Together, they're adding millions of barrels of new production to the market, and that is fundamentally shifting the entire balance of power. So let's start with the US. It's still the world's largest producer, and the Permian Basin is basically its engine room. I mean, huge advances in drilling tech have turned it into an absolute powerhouse, just churning out record amounts of oil. But here's the really critical part. That same innovation is now being used to lower the carbon intensity of each barrel. And in a world focused on emissions, that's a huge competitive advantage. And then you've got the breakout star of the show, Guyana. Seriously, this small South American nation has had a meteoric rise. We're talking from almost nothing to, by 2026, being set to produce over 900,000 barrels a day, all from its massive offshore Stabroek block. That is just a stunningly fast climb. And here's why this new oil is such a big deal, why it's so disruptive. The oil coming from places like Guyana and Brazil is what they call light and sweet. Basically, that just means it's higher quality, it's easier to refine, and so everyone wants it. It competes directly with the best, most premium barrels from the traditional producers. So, as you can imagine, all this new competition is forcing the hand of the old guard. OPEC and its leader Saudi Arabia, they just can't ignore this flood of new oil. They're being forced to react, and believe me, their whole strategy is changing dramatically. For decades, OPEC's playbook was simple: cut production to keep prices high. Well, that's over. The new game is all about defending market share. We're seeing Saudi Arabia actually cutting its official selling prices to places like Asia, all to compete head-on with these new barrels coming from the Americas. But, this new strategy comes at a really steep cost. Lower prices mean less money coming in. It's that simple. For OPEC, total revenues from crude exports are projected to fall to $410 billion by 2026. That is a massive financial hit for economies that are built on oil income. And that brings us to a really important term, the fiscal break-even price. All that means is it's the minimum price per barrel a country needs just to balance its national budget. So with prices potentially heading down toward the 50s, a lot of these nations are going to face enormous budget problems. It even threatens huge national projects, like Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030. Okay, so you've got the old guard fighting for market share in the official economy. But there's a wild card here, a factor that could just throw all these forecasts right out the window.
And that's a massive parallel oil market that's operating completely in the shadows. This is the world of sanctioned oil. You have countries like Russia and Iran who are facing Western sanctions. So what do? They create a whole separate trading system just to keep their crude flowing. They use what's called a dark fleet of tankers and all kinds of shadowy financial networks to sell their oil, mostly to buyers in Asia. And here's the incentive. Here's why it works. This sanctioned oil sells at a huge discount. We're talking as much as $8 per barrel cheaper than the official price. For buyers, that's a bargain that's just too good to pass up. And the effect is, it keeps millions of extra barrels in the global supply chain. But this whole situation creates a massive risk. Right now, the shadow supply is helping to keep the market oversupplied and prices low. So, what happens if, say, new sanctions or some kind of military event suddenly takes all that oil off the market? Well, the global surplus could just vanish, almost overnight. That could trigger what's called a war premium, spiking prices right back up toward $90 a barrel. It is, without a doubt, the biggest uncertainty in the entire market.
Okay, so let's put all these pieces together. You have the supply glut, you have the big strategic changes, and you have this wild shadow market. What does it all tell us about the future of energy? Well, it tells us that the rules of the game have fundamentally, completely changed.
It looks like there are 4 big themes that are going to define this new era. First, just plain supply abundance, mostly driven by the Americas. Second is something we touched on, technological decarbonization. You know, producers using tech to lower their emissions and make their product more competitive. Third is market fragmentation, with that shadow market creating a kind of 2-tiered system. And finally, we have the strategic pivots, with the old powers fighting for market share instead of for high prices. And all this really brings us to the ultimate takeaway here. In the past, power in the oil world came from simply having the most oil in the ground. Not anymore. Now it comes from having the best technology. The winners in this new game are going to be the producers who use things like automation, AI, and advanced engineering to get that oil out of the ground cheaply, efficiently, and with a lighter carbon footprint. Which really leaves us with one last crucial question to think about. For decades, the saying was that whoever controlled the oil controlled the world. But in this new era of abundance, not scarcity, who truly holds the power now? Is it the low-cost producer? Is it the consumer who suddenly has all the choice? Or is it the innovator with the next big breakthrough? That, right there, is the new power game.